Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, The Impact of Cannabis Prohibition on Patients, Veterans, and Small Business Owners, a Personal Perspective, presented by Joe Grumbine, CEO of Willow Creek Springs, Incorporated. My name is Xavier Gutierrez, and I will be your moderator for today's event. We are delighted to bring you this educational web seminar presented by LabRoots. LabRoots is the leading scientific social networking website and producer of educational virtual events and webinars. Now, before we begin, I would like to remind everyone that this event is interactive. We encourage you to participate by submitting as many questions as you want during the presentation. Simply click on the Ask a Question box located on the far left of your screen and type your questions into the drop-down box. Our speaker will respond to your questions via email following the presentation. And if you have trouble seeing or hearing the presentation, please click on the Ask a Question box to let us know that you're experiencing a problem. This presentation is educational and thus offers continuing education credits. Please click on the Continuing Education Credits tab located in the top right corner of the presentation window and follow the process to obtain your credits. Now, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Joe Grumbine. I will now turn things over to him.
Excellent. Well, I thank everybody for allowing me the opportunity to speak here. And I want to introduce myself. My name is Joe Grumbine, and I am the CEO of a company called Willow Creek Springs. And we're a small family business that creates hemp-based products, and we also create CBD products and other cannabis products. And so part of this discussion is my personal perspective about how cannabis prohibition has impacted my small business, and also many others that I've been involved with and participate with. I want to give sort of a introduction of my qualifications, as I'm not a medical professional and I'm not a legal professional, but I work with a lot of both of those, and I have a lot of personal experience. I am, in addition to the CEO of Willow Creek Springs, I'm also the CEO of a civil rights nonprofit called the Human Solution International. And I'm going to be tying the work that we do with defendants and prisoners into this conversation, as it is clearly part of the impact of prohibition. I have been working with the cannabis plant for over 30 years, growing it, extracting, making compounding. I've been teaching classes, I think since about 2000, classes on cultivation, organic farming, herbal concentrates or herbal formulas, as well as compounding with infused products, standards, dosing, and that sort of thing. I've been working with a number of different schools and classes and that sort of thing. So I have a lot of personal experience without some of the fancy degrees and whatnot. I'm here to talk about these things because I think they have impacted so many people for so long. And I think that there's a lot of misinformation about where we are, where we're headed, and why things are prohibited, and actually how they're impacted, how they impact people. I think that first I'm going to give kind of a brief overview of cannabis prohibition. People think about cannabis today and they think, oh, well, it's legal in so many places. I'm a resident of California, and we've had laws that allow for certain things for more than 20 years. And I talk to people constantly and they, say, well, it's legal. And they don't realize that we're still in a system of prohibition. And I'm going to kind of explain that in addition to these impacts. So prior to 1930, cannabis was widely used as medicine, as a food, fuel, and fiber, all sorts of reasons it was used. And I'm not going to get into a lot of details, but it was a common plant. It was a plant that many people grew, many people used. It was in the pharmacopoeia up until about 1940. And in the 1930s, a couple of things happened. Alcohol prohibition was just repealed, and there was this pretty mammoth machine to go after the illegal alcohol businesses. And so to take its place, they developed the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, and Harry Anslinger was, the head of that. Well, he came out of the Alcohol Bureau, so it was kind of a messed up situation because, they took all the funding for one thing and they slid it over into another. All of a sudden, they started looking at illegal drugs. In 1936, Reefer Madness was produced. And if you know anything about information, the public's perception drives so many things, social policies, and ultimately the laws are directed by these public perceptions of things. And there began a campaign of fear, of racial bias, of misinformation, and hiding information. All of those things were combined through different media outlets. So back in the 30s, there weren't the same kinds of media that we all have here. There wasn't webinars, and there weren't social media and online anything. There were newspapers, and there were movies, and there was radio. And, there was, a lot of word to mouth information. So somebody would get a hold of information, they'd pass it along. Information was a lot slower to travel, and information was controlled by a very few number of people. So there were a few players that were involved. You got Harry Anslinger, and you've got William Randolph Hearst. He was a paper guy. He controlled a lot of the media. He also had issues with the hemp plant conflicting with his paper that was produced by lumber mills, by wood. You also have Andrew Mellon. He was a wealthy individual that was connected with Harry Anslinger. And then you have Lamont DuPont. And if you're familiar with the DuPont name, he was involved with the chemical industry. He made, I think it was rayon, polyester, that kind of thing. Made all sorts of petrochemical products. And if you know anything about the hemp plant, it is very much capable of producing just about anything that crude oil can. The first internal combustion engines were designed to run on a hemp oil fuel. Anything that is made out of oil, the hemp oil can produce. And again, that's a lot of technical stuff. I'm not going to put up a bunch of slides about the wonders of hemp. However, it is a very wonderful plant. Food, fuel, fiber, medicine. It gives all of these things. So then they got the Marijuana Tax Act that all of a sudden, for the first time, turned cannabis into a crime. And it restricted the use of it to just a few people for medical and industrial uses. And it created a new class of crime. It created a new type of criminal. And again, the literature that was put out was directed at the fears and the racial biases of people. And, it was pretty effective. Here we are many generations down the road, and much of the reefer madness put up almost in a satire is taken as fact in plenty of white papers that are drawn up by cities and law enforcement agencies. the same fears that they've implanted so long ago that weren't based on really any truths, people still believe today as fact. And, you know, that's part of the problem of prohibition, is it's a stigma that's been embedded, ingrained in our media and in a side of information that comes at us, you know, since the 30s. 1944, an interesting thing happened. There was a LaGuardia report that came out, and it basically disproved all of these things that were being implied by the Reefer Madness. And they said, you know, this really isn't what's happening. But that report got suppressed, and Nixon especially really buried it under the rug. They didn't want this information, the truth, to get out. And so through the course of, you know, the next 20, 30, 40 years, they did a lot of things, you know, media-wise to suppress this. In 1950 through 1956, there were a couple of laws that were passed, and they imposed, maybe for the first time, mandatory sentences for drug crimes. And this is where things really started to go sideways, as we're talking about these impacts. One of the main impacts that covers across all of these three categories is the criminal impact. Think about this for a second. A plant that just grows, and it grows naturally, wildly, all over the planet. We have strains of cannabis that grow virtually on every continent except for maybe Antarctica, and it's tailored itself to the environmental specialties of all of these different areas. And we decided that the possession, cultivation, transportation, distribution, manufacture of this plant is now a crime. We've essentially criminalized a plant. Never before had anything like that been done, and it doesn't make sense to me today. It probably didn't make sense to a lot of people as it was happening. This was a thing that was commonly used for so many things, and all of a sudden it was not only a crime, but a crime that was punishable by mandatory minimums. In 1970, this is when things really got sideways. So, you know, all the way up until 1970, there were all kinds of things that could have happened, and there were people that had gotten locked up, and there were raids and all kinds of things. But once you got to 1970, Richard Nixon passed the Controlled Substances Act, and that's when things really went south. Cannabis, marijuana, as it was called as a negative term, was put into Schedule 1 category. Now, of all the schedules, they start from 5 and they go up to 1. I don't think there's a 6, but I know that they go from the least harmful to the most harmful. And Schedule 1 is a compound that is considered to have no known medical use. It is considered to be highly addictive, and it is considered to be extremely harmful. And if you look at any study that's ever been done about the cannabis plant, you'll find out that there isn't anything about this plant that meets any of those categories. And it's one of the things that has always troubled me because, you know, we have a lot of people in our country that are law-abiding citizens, and they work hard to be lawful. And when you talk to them about cannabis, they will say something like, well, I don't really have a problem with it, but it's illegal, so I can't go near it. I'm not going to do anything that's illegal. I don't want to jeopardize my freedom. I don't want to risk, you know, being unlawful. And there hasn't been this giant outcry of, well, this is wrong. Now, if you think about some of the things that our nation has done over the history of our nation, you know, we've done some pretty horrible things. We've oppressed whole groups of people. We have allowed for slavery. We've not allowed women to own property, to vote. All of these things that we've done, we've not allowed people of same-sex persuasion to get married. There's been all these things that we've done in our history, and yet it was recognized over time that these are not correct. This isn't right, and changes have been made. And enough people got together, enough people were outraged, and they've made those changes. And one by one, we're gaining on it. Not that we've fixed everything, but I can't help but wonder how this one got left behind. It's as egregious as any of them, in my opinion, and maybe not that the simple act of creating a crime out of something that shouldn't be, but the fact that people are locked up, people have lost their property, they've lost their lives, they lost their jobs, they lost their children, they've lost their businesses, they've lost all of these things simply because of this plant. A simple, powerful effect of prohibition that goes across all of these lines. And yet there's not the outrage that there's been with the women's suffrage movement, that there's been with the civil rights movement. And in many ways, I think cannabis prohibition has affected at least as many people, and in maybe just as bad. You know, if you think about the horrors of our civil rights problems, racism and slavery and all the horrors that have happened through that, some of the same horrors have happened as a result of the DEA and raids and, the things that have happened to people. Plenty of people have been killed. They've been sentenced to long prison terms, life in prison. Can you imagine today in 2019, there are people serving life sentences for cannabis crimes today, right now. At the same time that we have people running stores, that we have all sorts of laws that are allowing certain things and not others, and yet prohibition still is running strong because we have people that are locked up for life today, right now, for cannabis and nothing else. I think this lays out the problem specifically as it reaches out to everybody. Now let's start walking through some of these groups of people. I would probably start with the small business. It's probably the easiest to address. Now, small businesses have been affected by prohibition specifically in a lot of ways. Most small business owners, again, as most people I think are in the nation, they try to be lawful. You know, people don't start a small business with the intent of breaking the law. It's kind of cross purpose. If your goal is to make a living, to grow a company, it would behoove you likely to follow laws if you can, right? In California, in 1996, we passed Proposition 215. We were the first one, or one of the first ones, to pass a medical law. And in essence, it was a very broadly written law on purpose that allowed for some basic rights for people who qualified as patients to grow, possess, consume, produce, and distribute the cannabis plant. And it was written this way. I've had a lot of conversations with some of the authors of this law, because when there's an ambiguity to a law, how the law is supposed to work, and if there's an ambiguity to a law and there's a conflict with law enforcement and there's a lack of clarity, it's supposed to err on the side of a defendant. So if you're accused of something and the law doesn't clearly say you can't do it in the way that you're being accused of it, you're supposed to have an allowance, and then they address it and correct the law if need be. But in California, as in so many of the other states that have later on passed laws that allowed for medical and ultimately recreational cannabis use, what's happened is law enforcement, the courts have erred on the side of law enforcement in the courts. And for a good long while, a lot of people were getting locked up, even though they were, in their opinions, following the law. Many times in the opinions of legal experts that these people had consulted. And so you have a whole generation, 20 years in California, of people that had medical grows, medical collectives, and all of the different facets of that, including manufacturing, transportation, sales, and all of the things that have to do with it, all of the different facets of this. And I want to be mindful of all of these other crimes that they have out there. It's because most of the time when you hear about a legislative act that says, oh, well, we're expunging all of these cannabis crimes, and we're decriminalizing this, and we're doing these things, and people go, wow, look, we're making so much progress. Generally, what happens in most of the laws that allow for recreational and medical use, generally, the things that they touch most on is simple possession. And granted, as this affects a huge swath of people, there are many, many, many people that have been charged with criminal possession. Most of the real problems come from other charges: possession with intent to sell, manufacturing, transportation, and all of these things, and even conspiracies. I don't think that a lot of people realize that because, again, the media feeds us, oh, California, we passed our rec laws, so they're expunging all of these felonies or all of these cannabis charges. But generally what they're expunging and what they're removing are simple possession cases. I think it's important to know that, because rather than stopping and saying, okay, we've accomplished this, we're done, I think we need to evaluate and say, what is our end game? What is the goal? You know, if we're decommissioning cannabis prohibition, I think it needs to be addressed. And frankly, most of the time, I don't think it is. So you have small businesses that have been turned into criminals. At one point in 2007, I had opened up a cannabis collective, medical collective. And ultimately, I had 3 of them in 2009. I was arrested for the first time in my life. I was 42 years old, and I got arrested for the first time in my life. I was following California law to the best of my ability. As far as I knew, I should have been immune from this. I knew that there was federal law that still applied, and I knew that we took a risk of violating federal law, but we took that risk. A lot of times change, political and social change, happens when people are willing to take a risk. People are willing to challenge these laws. They're willing to stand up. When the state of California stood up to the federal government and said, you know what, we're going to go ahead and pass this, even though the Controlled Substances Act stands. And to this day, it stands unchanged, as it was back in 1970. We took that chance, and it wasn't the federal government that came and caused me problems. It was the state. The state arrested me and didn't recognize anything, any of the medical proofs that I had. They just locked me up and they charged me with crimes. Well, that's when I became aware. That's when that big light bulb turned on in 2009. I was sitting in a holding cell thinking to myself, I never even had a parking ticket, a speeding ticket, I should say. I've had parking tickets. I've never been accused of a crime. Hell, I don't even have any enemies. how is it that I'm sitting here locked up with a bunch of criminals? And over the next year, I fought this case, had to hire an attorney, continued to operate my collective. In fact, just continued on as I was pretty confident I was going to beat the case. Ultimately, a year later, and I don't know, I think about 20 trips to court, I had my case dismissed, and the judge said I was found to be compliant with all California law, and my case was to be dismissed, and all my property was to be returned. However, the Riverside County sheriffs had forfeited my money that they seized and sent it off to the federal government. They told me, well, you can go ahead and get it from them. As you can imagine, I didn't find that to be too much of a good idea and took it as a loss. 2 weeks later, I was raided. And this time they came in and they hit everything. Same thing, the state, wasn't the feds. And they had determined that I was a criminal. They were going to get me. So this time it was Long Beach. It was LA County. Well, I spent the next 6 years fighting that case and lost everything I'd ever had. Almost lost my home, lost my business, lost friends, family, was locked up over 4 times, again, with criminals. You want to talk about an impact to a small business? It was a devastating impact. And it was devastating to all the people around me. It was devastating to the people that supported me. And ultimately, 6 years later, I was exonerated. Well, you don't get anything back. You don't get your time back. You don't get the experience of being locked up back. You don't get the abuse back. You don't get any of those things back. You get to start all over again. And I'm thankful for that. And I've taken this opportunity to not only start all over again, but to thrive. In the course of all of these things that happened, I started a company called the Human Solution International. You see this little ribbon here. This is what we call a solidarity ribbon. And the Human Solution International is an organization, it's a nonprofit that stands together and helps people like me that have been charged. And we stand up in courts. We get up as expert witnesses. We give personal support. We support prisoners. We support people that have lost their homes, their families, their jobs. We help out in a number of different ways. That's actually maybe a positive thing that came out of Prohibition when this organization was formed. So with regards to small businesses today, we now have a huge conflict of laws. We have the Farm Bill Act that allows for the production of hemp. We have CBD that is running all over the place. Big money's coming in, the big green wave coming into all different places. States that have medical laws, recreational laws, no laws at all. In California, we have CBD that's being regulated differently than the medical cannabis and the recreational cannabis. And it's really convoluted. The regulations that have come out of all of this, in my opinion, have caused as much or more harm than good. There are businesses that are opening up, believing that they're following the law, and they're not. We have recreational stores and medical stores that have opened up, and the handful of them that have been able to comply with the state laws have now turned on those that haven't. So now you have the very people that used to be part of the so-called cannabis movement that, we're all in the same boat a few years ago. And now a couple of them have moved forward and gotten certain licensing and certain approvals. And they're going around now and they're attacking those that don't because they're competition. So it's, again, it's turned brother against brother. Some of the same stuff that's come out of, some of these other major problems that the nation's had. So as far as small businesses go, there's still a huge risk. There are merchant services that will not process credit cards, even for hemp companies. If you're a CBD company, you can't get a credit card processed. The banks won't take your money. You can't run a legitimate business, even though you might have a legitimate license to have a legitimate business. There's no banking. It's all FDIC insured, and the federal law says, well, this is illegal. So we have major problems. There's breakthroughs happening, but they haven't happened yet. And when I was going through my trial, one of the things that they accused me of was running an all-cash business. In their opinion, that was one of the indicators of an illegal business, the fact that I was an all-cash business. Now, that's not to say that there aren't plenty of all-cash laundromats and restaurants and all sorts of other small businesses. But in today's day and age, if you can't do banking, it doesn't make sense that you can be so-called a legitimate business and not have that legitimacy. So now I want to talk about veterans. Now, I ran a collective again for many years, and I work with a lot of veterans in my nonprofit, and I've interviewed many, many veterans. I'm not a veteran. I come from a family of veterans that goes all the way back to the Revolutionary War, and I support the people that think that that's important, and I think that it is an important thing. But regardless of that, there are people that have put themselves in harm's way in the name of serving our nation, and they'll go out and they'll be put into a combat situation. They'll have experienced horrible things, giving them mental issues, PTSD, all sorts of problems, and not counting possibly being exposed to chemicals, and of course, not even talking about physiological injuries. These veterans come back home, and in many cases, it goes sideways from there with mental issues. We have a homeless veteran problem that is just rampant. But I want to talk more specifically about just the veterans' access to cannabis and how cannabis prohibition has kept that from happening. I know a lot of veterans, and in fact, the Human Solution International has advocated for several of them as they were fighting through criminal cases that came from them trying to treat themselves. And I'll give one case in particular, a guy by the name of Chris. He was a Marine, served tours in Afghanistan and the Middle East, came back. He had injuries, he had PTSD, he had all sorts of things. The VA had put him on a cocktail of, I don't know, it was over 30 pharmaceutical drugs. He had almost lost his career over it because these drugs put him into a stupor. He didn't remember things. He would fall asleep. He was combative. His marriage was falling apart over it. He had young children he wasn't able to take care of correctly. Everything was wrong. And it was these pharmaceutical drugs that were the culprit. He discovered that cannabis might be helpful, started self-medicating. Within, I think it was 6 to 9 months' time, I have several interviews with him, but I want to make sure I get the information correct if I can. He was off of all of these medications and simply using cannabis. And one by one, by the use of cannabis, he was able to stop taking one. And because he stopped taking one, the side effects from that, so he could stop taking another one. And one by one, he eliminated all of these pharmaceutical drugs. And he was able to function better than he was before. But what happens is when the VA finds out that you're using cannabis, they will not allow you to have certain medications. They don't go after you or anything, but they'll say, well, you don't get to have this pain medication that you might need. And I know there's a huge problem with pain medications and opiates and that sort of thing, but sometimes they're necessary for periods of time. Sometimes people have injuries or conditions that require more than cannabis from time to time. But if you're a veteran and they find out that you're using cannabis, you'll be cut off of a number of different pharmaceutical drugs, pain relievers mostly. And I have this from personal experience. Now, what has happened in numerous cases is there's been these memos, and the VA administrator will say, well, we're looking into and we're looking at allowing veterans to have cannabis use. But what always comes back is the Controlled Substances Act. Cannabis is Schedule 1. And what that means is, no, you can't have it. In a lot of these cases, going back to the small business, I've watched dispensary owners in federal trials try to use as a defense, the Cole memo, the Ogden memo, these memos that attorney generals had issued over the years saying that, well, we're not going to act if this, that, or the other thing has happened. And then you get into court and you sit with a federal judge, and what do they say? They say, well, that's not the law. And in this courtroom, only the law applies. And there's only one law that applies, and that's the Controlled Substances Act. And what it says, in essence, is no, you can't have it. So the federal government has not changed its tune one iota when it comes to cannabis, when it comes to possession, cultivation, transportation, distribution, and the like. No, is what it says. And even though they may not go after everybody the way that they have in the past, they can and they could go after any of these businesses. It's something that people need to be aware of, and I just don't think that many are. So as far as veterans goes, there has been a recent bill that's been introduced, and Congressman Earl Blumenauer in the 3rd District of Oregon proposed a bill to the House of Representatives that would allow VA physicians to issue recommendations and opinions to veterans who are residents of states with state marijuana programs, according to the participation of veterans in such state marijuana programs. Hey, that's a start. If the VA actually can get this bill to go through, and maybe they'll recognize the need for this in this one small thing, maybe it'll open up the door. But today it's not. And there are thousands, probably tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of vets that are negatively impacted. I worked with a doctor, clinical psychiatrist by the name of Dr. Fitchner, and he had done a study on PTSD and cannabis. And again, I don't have enough time to get into the clinical elements of all of this, but he's demonstrated in a limited clinical study that cannabis can help PTSD. If we could just imagine that there was a pharmaceutical drug that, if it did nothing else but helped you relax, helped you sleep, helped you eat, helped you generally feel better, and had no verified negative side effects except for possibly an occasional hunger, dry mouth, and a general feeling of well-being. If we had a clinical pharmaceutical compound that would do that, the developer of that drug would be rich beyond measure. Am I describing anything you might be aware of? Oh yeah, the cannabis plant. And the cannabis plant is guilty of just exactly that. All right, now we're going to talk about patience. And, time goes by so fast when we start doing these things. So I'm trying to make sure I'm able to touch on all the topics. Patience is a giant word. A patient is anybody who has an ailment, an injury, would be needing medical attention in any way. A mental patient could be a patient. Somebody who has a disease could be a patient. Somebody who has an injury could be a patient. And it goes on and on. Even somebody who has an addiction to other drugs. And I want to jump right into that because I think that's something that's starting to be explored. And I think it's an important thing to address. Cannabis prohibition, part of its rhetoric is simply that it's the gateway to hell. It is the precursor to other drug use. It is the thing that is the slippery slope, the stepping stone. It's the It's the one that you take a puff of marijuana, and the next thing you know, you're slamming heroin. They're finding out today, and we've been experiencing for 30 years, that most, or I don't know about most, but a lot of people that have opiate addictions didn't do anything wrong. They were following the law, and they were following the advice of their doctor, their medical professional, who prescribed them FDA-approved legal pharmaceutical drugs to help them with pain, to help them with whatever that ailment was. And they found themselves addicted. And in some cases, when I was running my collective, I would deal with clients. I can't call them patients, but I dealt with over 10,000 of them, clients. And of many of them would come and they'd tell me this, and it was a heartbreaking story. They'd say, I had an operation, and the doctor gave me Oxycontin or whatever the opiate was. And it helped for a while, but now every month he gives me a month's supply, and 2 or 3 days before my supply can be refilled, I run out. And every month I have to go through withdrawals, and it's hell. It's horrible. I get sick. I want to die. They tell me that. And, at the time, this was before we had, lab tested concentrates, but we had concentrates. And I would advise them, well, if you were to try some of this and really, get yourself a decent dose, it might be helpful. And we discovered that many times, if not almost 100% of the time, if somebody was to actually do this right, they would find themselves weaning themselves off of these opiates. And they would come back the next month and they'd say, wow, you know what? This month I had a couple pills left over. And a couple of months later, they'd say, you know what? I'm cutting my my strength down. And they would, one by one, I mean, it didn't happen every time, but it happened plenty of times. One by one, they would say, you know what? I'm free. I'm free of this addiction. And it was cannabis that did it. And I had an epiphany when that happened, the first time, the second time, the third time I met it. Said, wow, it's the gateway out of hell. And maybe there's something we could do about it. And I'm working with a number of physicians right now on programs to help people get off of addiction, alcohol, tobacco, opiates, and we're having some good effect. Imagine if we didn't have cannabis prohibition and we could use these medicines early on as an adjunct therapy, maybe give them the heavier dose opiates as they, are in the throes of a recovery of a major injury, and use the cannabis therapy to get them off quick. Imagine the years of life and the lack of organ damage and all the problems that have come from these pharmaceutical drugs. It's just something to think about. Psych meds. How many people today are on psych meds? There's all kinds of negative side effects that can happen. If you look at most psych med prescriptions, you'll see, warning, may cause suicidal thoughts. This thing that's supposed to help you make you feel better might make you want to kill yourself. We talk about FDA approval. We talk about all of these things as though they're the only thing that matter. And yet, this is a thing that doesn't get addressed. It doesn't get addressed often enough. It gets addressed occasionally, but not often enough and not to the right people. There has not been one proven case of anybody dying from cannabis, not one. Why isn't that being driven home? Don't know the answer to that, but I do know that cannabis prohibition is still running rampant, and it's making it so that people that otherwise would have access to this don't. It has created an environment where people have had to flee their homes in states where there is not any access whatsoever. They've had to make choices between being legal and lawful and doing the right thing, taking care of their children that have seizures, taking care of their selves or their loved ones that have cancer. Can you imagine an impact of prohibition that would be more powerful than having to choose? Do I break the law and risk getting thrown in jail, losing my home, losing everything, losing my children, or do I take a chance and take a chance of a treatment that might save me? Cancer, for example, I don't know, just a thing that I don't have nearly enough time to discuss, but we have documented cases, hundreds, thousands of them, of people treating themselves with cannabis oil and watching tumors shrink and go into remission and doing nothing else. Now, I can't claim anything, but I've watched it over and over again. And every one of those people have taken a chance. Can you imagine the angst that these people go through when they make a choice like that? Do you know the harm that stress can cause? Imagine what it might be like if we ended cannabis prohibition and somebody could just go and get this oil and get these treatments. I've watched people get off of psych meds. I've watched people shrink tumors. I have watched people do all of these things, but they were taking a chance. They had to risk a criminal action. And I have watched people that took that chance and got caught. You want to know an impact, a negative impact of cannabis prohibition? You watch a sick person. I sat there in a trial, many trials, but one in particular. A woman who had cancer and had AIDS and had used cannabis to treat herself. They had a little garden. Wasn't a huge garden. And the state came in and raided them, took all of their medicine, and in some cases, that is the biggest impact of them all. There's a man by the name of Peter McWilliams early on in the medical law of California, and he died because he didn't get his medicine. A prolific writer, a public speaker, an amazing guy. But he didn't get his medicine because of prohibition, and now he's not with us anymore. There are so many people. I know a woman named Dolores from Missouri. Her husband's not with us anymore. She got raided from a small grow that they had, and husband didn't get the medicine he needed. And while he was in custody or going through their case, he passed away. Later on, she was an RN. Later on, she had to go through losing her license, and she had to go through a hearing. She had to go through a hearing for moral turpitude. Can you imagine being charged with a moral crime, with an ethics violation because you had grown a plant that helped you and your husband and maybe some sick people that you knew? Ultimately, my nonprofit was able to intervene, and we had a pretty substantial campaign, and she ended up getting her license back, and she's practicing today. But if you want to talk about a negative impact of cannabis prohibition, so I've only got a couple of minutes left, and I want to get into maybe the most important part. What can we do about this? We have passed law after law after law, and people believe that this work is done. We're positioning ourselves for big pharma to take control of these compounds, and the people are not going to be able to have it. People keep talking about scheduling it to 2 or 3 or 4 or 5. A Schedule 5 substance still needs to be prescribed. You're not going to be able to access this plant unless we decriminalize it. There are laws in the book. I mean, there are bills going through both sides of Congress right now that could ultimately decriminalize this plant. But they die in committee every session. We could get active. We could start talking about this. At the end of the day, if Big Pharma controls this, it's not going to change one bit. The black market's going to continue, and prohibition will still exist. I realize I'm running out of time. I am very grateful for the opportunity to communicate with everybody. I want you to be mindful that there are still people in prison today. There are still people going through trials today. There are people being raided today. There are sick people that are not able to get medicine. And imagine this, okay? You passed a law, you got a recreational law, you can go to a store, you need oil because you have cancer, and guess what? You can't afford it, and your insurance is not going to cover it. I don't know. You know, it's not over, folks. We can make a difference. I encourage you to participate. If you want to get involved, you can contact the Human Solution International. I'm here to answer any questions. Hopefully, we'll get lots of questions that come out of this, and hopefully we can make the change and leave a world for our kids where prohibition is over. I thank you very much. I think my time is up, and I think that's it.
Thank you, Joe, for sharing your perspective. I would also like to thank LabRoots for making today's educational webcast possible. And as a final reminder, our speaker will follow up with any questions you've submitted via email. That's all for now. Thank you for joining us, and we hope to see you again soon. Goodbye.